So how then did the Qing react to this difficult situation? I mean, this one country of Britain was able to defeat them easily in the First Opium War, and I didn't mention it yet, but there was actually a Second Opium War in which the Qing were once again defeated, this time by Britain and France. They were only able to put down the Taiping Rebellion with the help of foreigners. This is not a good situation. So there is a recognition among some members of the Qing Empire, both Manchus and Chinese, that something has to change. And the dominant idea of reform that develops is something called self-strengthening. This is basically this idea that, in a sense, we can stay fundamentally who we are, we just need some new technology, right? In other words, we are able to, if we just obtain some new technology, that's enough. We don't need to change our politics. Remember, for China, there was this very strong emphasis on the idea that their emperor was the son of heaven and was this mediator between heaven and earth. So political change is kind of difficult for them, right? Because they understood their politics as being based off of the very nature of the universe. It's hard to change that. And they've been successful for a very long time. We also have to remember this imperial system had worked very well for a long time. So they didn't really see the need to make that much of a change. Let's just obtain some new technology, but we don't need to change anything else. So in a sense, they're trying to get the Industrial Revolution without the political, economic, or scientific revolutions, and it's only kind of a halfway Industrial Revolution because basically all they want to do is build some guns. And you can see that in this picture here, and notice that all the people in that picture are wearing traditional clothing, right? So there's this idea that nothing really needs to change much, we just need some modern weapons. So in a sense, we can test how good this self-strengthening is, how effective it is, by having a war. Right? Remember we did that with the 7 Years' War, and we were asking, okay, which system of government is going to give you more power? You know, the democracy and centralization of the British, or the absolutism and divine right centralization of the French? Well, we have something else similar here, right? We're going to have a look at a war between China and Japan over Korea to see if this reform is going to be enough, this kind of self-strengthening reform. So in the 19th century, a German military advisor to Japan told Japan that Korea is aimed at the heart of Japan like a dagger, right? Korea is a dagger at the heart of Japan. And you could also argue that Korea was a dagger aimed at the heart of China as well, because the capital, Beijing, is very close to Korea. And if you have control over Korea, you could station a navy there that could threaten Beijing. So Korea is a very important piece of real estate. It's very strategic. And for a long time, Korea was just fine on its own. Koreans were quite capable of self-government and maintaining their independence. But now that there's this growing imperialism, there's this growing competition for colonies, people are going to make a greater effort to gain control over Korea. So the poor Koreans, people are fighting over their country, and they're going to find themselves in a very difficult situation for how, in terms of what they're going to do to try and defend their independence. And unfortunately, they're not going to be able to. They're eventually going to become a colony of Japan. But we have to stress, in the past, that Korea had been an invasion route. Remember, Japan had tried under Hideyoshi to invade China through Korea. In the 13th century, the Mongols had tried to invade Japan through Korea. So Japan and China both have this heightened concern over Korea and who has influence in Korea. And they want to make sure that Korea is either friendly to them or is under their control. And as Korea is going to be relatively weak during this time period, they're very much afraid that someone hostile to them will gain control over Korea and then use that as a staging base to threaten their own security. So there's this competition between Japan and China over influence, over control, over Korea, primarily for strategic reasons and ideas of trying to fulfill their own security. And eventually this will lead to a war, this kind of concern over Korea and over who has influence in Korea. We call this the Sino-Japanese War. It's a little confusing. We don't call it the Chino or Chinese-Japanese War. It's traditionally called the Sino-Japanese War. So just keep this in mind, that Sino means Chinese. And this is being essentially fought over control of Korea. And what's striking is, remember we talked about how China had undertaken these reforms called self-strengthening, which were basically conservative, that said, okay, we just need kind of a halfway industrial revolution. We don't need those other revolutions we've been talking about. Japan, in contrast, and we'll talk more about Japan later, Japan is going to undertake radical reforms. Japan will completely revise its political system, its social system, and will try and undertake, and does undertake them largely successfully, the revolutions we've been talking about. And Japan just absolutely, completely walks over China, right? Japan just absolutely, completely walks over China. Once again, China does not win any significant battles. Japan just easily, just absolutely destroys China in this war. It's not even a contest, really. It's really striking how badly China loses. And there's lots of reasons for China's loss. There's lots of reasons for its loss. But I want to give just two that kind of give us an idea and an understanding of the problem that we have in terms of China's lack of nationalism. One thing I want to stress, China, because it had undertaken self-strengthening, actually had an army that was about as technologically advanced as Japan's army. China's navy, for example, and I'm going to focus on the navy, actually was superior in terms of ships compared to Japan. For example, China had 2 battleships. Japan had no battleships. And yet Japan easily defeated China's navy, right? Japan easily defeated China's navy. So, and I'm going to argue here that key to this are problems rising from China's lack of nationalism, from failing to undertake a political revolution that would bring in nationalism. So let me give you 2 examples. China had essentially 2 navies, right? China had a northern fleet and a southern fleet. And this is kind of typical. Usually you give different, naval units a kind of jurisdiction. You give them an area that they are in charge of, right? Now, what happened was, however, there was no unified naval command. So there was a northern fleet and there was a southern fleet, but there was no one person, other than perhaps the emperor, who had supreme command over both naval fleets. So what happened there, you'll notice in that map that Japan is going to attack in northern China, and the northern fleet asked the southern fleet for help, and the southern fleet actually said, no, we're not going to help you. We're not going to assist you. It doesn't matter that we are in a fight, a struggle for our lives. We are not going to help you. We are not going to assist you. So the Japanese were able to just utterly destroy the northern Chinese fleet, and the southern Chinese fleet did not lift a finger to help them, and they were not ordered to go help them. Now you may ask yourself, well, this is nuts. This is crazy. Why didn't they have a unified command? Why didn't the emperor step in? And the answer is simple. The emperor feared giving too much power to any single military officer out of fear that that military officer might overthrow the emperor. Right, so let me repeat that. The emperor did not want to give supreme unified command to any one military official, because doing so would make that official very powerful, and the emperor was afraid that a powerful official might try and overthrow the emperor. Now, that represents a lack of nationalism, a lack of loyalty to the nation state. Right, there was this fear that the commanders would, because they lacked nationalism, would choose to advance their own interests and overthrow the emperor rather than working for the good of the country. Right, so because China lacks nationalism, there's not this shared loyalty to a nation state that would allow the emperor to trust anyone to have supreme command, and this led to military defeat. To give you another example, the way that naval artillery worked during this time period, when you fired like naval guns, they fired a shell that was full of explosives, right? They didn't fire a cannonball that would just, make a hole in a ship. They fired a shell that was full of explosives so that when it hit the enemy ship, ideally it would explode and do a lot of damage. Now, the Japanese shells, when they hit Chinese ships, exploded. But when the Chinese shells hit Japanese ships, they often did not explode. And the reason is because someone had taken out the gunpowder and sold it, and then filled the shell with sand or some other material that would not explode. Now that's a serious issue of corruption, right? Can you imagine that, right? People are taking the gunpowder out of these shells and selling it in order to make money. And this, of course, leads to military defeat. Why do they do this? Because their own corruption, their own selfishness leads them to do so. They don't say, oh, I can't do this because this could make my country lose a war. They say, I don't care whether my country wins or loses. I just want to make me some money. And that, again, represents a lack of nationalism. So I think through those two examples, you can kind of see how China, even though it did get the technology, like I said, it actually had battleships. Japan didn't have any battleships. Yet Japan won these naval battles because of its nationalism, led it to have officials who were, military officials who were loyal to their emperor, and to people who would actually not sell the gunpowder from their artillery shells, right? People who would basically make sure that the army was relatively honest and not corrupt, so that the soldiers would have the tools they needed to win. Now, the results of the war were somewhat similar to what we saw earlier with the Opium War. Japan is paid an indemnity, which is worth several times the amount of Japan's annual budget. China has to pay the Japanese a huge amount of money, equal to several times their annual budget, the Japanese annual budget. And Japan will also get some territory from China, right? So this is going to make it's going to represent to Chinese people how they really need to change, how there are problems, right? There are serious problems. It was one thing for Westerners to defeat the China, but Japan, this country that Chinese people had kind of, seen as subordinate to them, has now defeated them, right? And it defeated them by undertaking radical reforms. So many Chinese people are convinced that China also needs to undertake radical reforms in order to strengthen its country. And yet, despite the fact that many Chinese people are convinced of the need to reform, the Manchus, the Qing, do not want to reform. Right? They do not want to reform. Now, this may seem kind of strange. Why would the Qing refuse to reform? Especially when many Chinese people are convinced of the need to reform. Right? Why would the Manchus do this? Well, first of all, I think it will help if we just kind of go through the different revolutions that help make the West powerful. The Qing will reject the scientific revolution because they emphasize moral rather than technical knowledge. Remember, they had connected themselves to Confucianism. Kangxi had emphasized that he accepted Confucianism, and that's why the Chinese had accepted the Qing Empire. That had held the empire together and worked for a long time, and while many Chinese did see a need for reform, not all did. Many Chinese still believed in Confucianism. And that's because, in part, that it would harm their power if they choose to move to a new kind of knowledge. Right? Remember, they were these people who followed Confucianism emphasized moral rather than technical knowledge. And remember, many of them had been spending years preparing to take the exams that would make them officials. You had officials who had become officials because of their knowledge of Confucianism. You had people who were teachers who had students and were paid to be teachers because they knew about Confucianism and could teach about it. All those people would lose power if they changed to a new form of knowledge that emphasized science and technical knowledge, right? If your power derives from Confucianism because you're an official that passed the Confucian exams, because you're a teacher, or if you're just a student studying Confucianism in hopes of taking the exams and one day passing them and becoming official, switching to a new kind of knowledge now would hurt you. It would hurt you. So there's going to be this kind of resistance, and there's this kind of alliance between these Confucians and the Qing Empire, that they will basically kind of support each other. So even though there's many Chinese who want significant radical change like Japan, there's other Chinese who still want change or reform, but within a Confucian system. And there's also still a kind of xenophobia in China, and almost a kind of racism. These Westerners are barbarians. how can we possibly treat barbarians as our teachers, right? How can we get rid of Confucius, the center, the font of civilization, and treat these barbarians as teachers? And bluntly speaking, if you don't have a scientific revolution, you cannot have an industrial revolution, right? Unless you have this basic shift that accepts technical and scientific knowledge is important, you're not going to have an industrial revolution. So the Qing, in a sense, are they have reasons for rejecting these revolutions, though in the end, rejecting the revolutions, as you can see, is making China weak. So we had talked about also that there was a political revolution, and I gave you examples of how nationalism, or rather a lack of nationalism, had made the Chinese weak, had made the Qing Empire weak in its war with both Britain and its war with Japan. So why not simply just adopt democracy and nationalism, adopt that political revolution? Well, here's the problem. No one had elected the Manchus. No one had elected the Qing to be in charge. Their legitimacy came from the idea that they were chosen by heaven. And if they got rid of that idea, the Chinese may say, well, hey, we believe in democracy. We don't think that we Han Chinese should be ruled by you Manchus anymore. We would like to have our own dynasty or our own government or something other than you. Right? The Manchus, the Qing, their legitimacy did not come from democracy. No one had ever elected them. And if they switched to democracy, someone may say, hey, we don't want you in power anymore. So they ruled with this idea of the mandate of heaven. So they don't want this democracy. In addition, they don't want to encourage nationalism because most Chinese people were Han, not Manchu. They were different ethnic groups. And if they encouraged nationalism, people would not focus on Manchu or Qing nationalism. They would focus on Chinese Han nationalism, which would mean overthrowing the Qing, overthrowing the Manchu, right? So that's, in a sense, why they are going to reject it, right? That's why they're going to reject it. Because essentially, to support modern political ideas would hurt the Qing, right? Would hurt the Qing because it would destroy their legitimacy. They also will reject an economic revolution as well because, again, it just doesn't seem to promise to help them. They're in a weak position. And finally, one thing we have to stress, this system had worked really well for a long time, and many Chinese people, many Manchu people also, were true believers in a moral universe. This old idea of Confucianism, of this kind of dream of China as this very special place, the central kingdom in the entire universe, was a very powerful source of identity and meaning, and it had worked so well in the past, it was hard to believe that it wouldn't somehow work now. So many Chinese, even those who believe in reform, even fairly radical reform, are still going to stick to this kind of basic Confucian idea. And the Qing are betting that that's going to be good enough so they don't have to undertake these really radical reforms like democracy and nationalism, which would eventually destroy them if they were accepted. Now, what will happen is, after the Sino-Japanese War, a group of Confucian reformers will actually gain the attention of the emperor and will actually engage in what are called the 100 Days of Reform. So they're going to try and undertake fairly radical reforms, but within a Confucian model. So they're going to try and stay within Confucius and those ideas. They're still not going to completely accept the revolutions that made the West and Japan so powerful. However, even this kind of Confucian reform is seen as threatening by many of the Manchu elite, and they will actually have some of these reformers killed. Others will be driven into exile, and the emperor who supported them will be effectively put under house arrest. And this older lady called the Queen Dowager, named Cixi, will actually basically become the ruler of China, and she's conservative and doesn't really want any change. So even this attempt at Confucian-based reform is considered too threatening and shut down by the Manchu Qing. In 1898, there will be an anti-foreign peasant rising, which we call the Boxer Rebellion. This is predominantly aimed at foreigners, particularly missionaries. Chinese Christians were considered kind of secondary foreigners and were also attacked. So this is kind of a reaction to growing foreign power, growing foreign influence in China. and it especially is targeting Christianity. And you can see on the right, those are pictures of the boxers, and they were called boxers by Westerners because they practiced various martial arts. Now, the Qing were happy about this and would actually ally with the rebels, right? So it's weird that we call this a rebellion because they weren't rebelling against the Chinese government. They were rebelling against foreign influence in China, right? So this group will actually support the government. The government will support them. So the Qing will ally with these Boxer rebels in an attempt to rely on the power of the people to kick foreigners out of China. Basically, they believe, now we've got these peasants behind us. They're rising up. There's hundreds of millions of them. They'll kick the foreigners out. So with great confidence, the Qing will declare war on 11 countries, right? On 11 countries. And this is just a partial list, but this includes Britain, France, the Austrian Empire, Germany, Japan, the United States, Russia, and the Netherlands. And all those countries, except for the Netherlands, will actually then counter by invading Qing China, right? So this is really astounding. The Qing had such faith in the power of these peasants to defeat foreign enemies that it's going to declare war on 11 countries when it couldn't even defeat one. And 8 of the countries will respond to this and to attacks on their citizens and their interests by actually invading China and once again humiliating China. I mean, they just absolutely devastate the rebellion and any Qing forces that try and fight them. And at this point, once they've been defeated, once the power of the people has been put down, the Qing finally say, okay, I guess we need some radical reform. And they will actually attempt at this point to establish basically a constitutional monarchy with some democracy, right? So only at this point are the Manchus willing to admit, okay, we need reform. And what's striking is, it turns out they were right to try not to reform in the first place. Because what happens is, this is basically too little, too late. Their major support had been the Confucians, but now the Manchu Qing have basically given up on Confucianism and have turned towards democracy. So they no longer support the Manchus, but now the radicals want more. They don't want a China ruled by the Manchus, whether they're constitutional monarchs or not. They want a China that is a republic and that is ruled by Han Chinese. So in the end, in a sense, the Manchus had actually been right to oppose reform because it would eventually lead to their destruction. As we'll see, that's what's going to happen to them. So they were really in a catch-22, right? If the Qing didn't reform, we saw what happened. They get beat up by foreign countries and they can't even put down rebellions. But once they do reform, they get overthrown, which we'll see shortly. And we can see this particularly in the case of Sun Yat-sen. Sun Yat-sen was originally a reformer who wanted to save the Qing dynasty, but in part because they rejected him, they didn't give him a job when he offered to help reform. He is going to become a revolutionary who says, we need to completely get rid of the Qing Empire. We need to get rid of these guys. They're doing a bad job ruling China. China for the Chinese. The Chinese should be in charge of China. So he is a nationalist, right? Sun Yat-sen is a nationalist who wants the Han Chinese to rule China. He says, I don't care about these Manchu. They're a different ethnic group. They have different customs. They should not be ruling China. We Chinese should rule China. And he will, because he's a revolutionary, he has to flee China because the Qing really, really, really want to kill him. He will flee China and become an important exile leader. He'll work among Chinese communities that are scattered all throughout the world in an attempt to foment his revolution. And he's really impressed by Western power. He sees the West as a source of power and as a source of freedom and so forth. He sees the West as the model which China should follow. And so you can see this just by looking at this picture of him. That's him with his wife. And you can see he is dressed in Western style as his wife, right? There's this idea we're going to try and follow a Western model. Sun will convert to Protestant Christianity. And it's important to stress this time period that Christianity was not simply a series of doctrines that you believed about Jesus or God or however you want to phrase it. Christianity was understood to be the center, the source of Western civilization among many people, especially Western Christians. And it was believed to be the civilized religion, and if you followed it, it would help you to become civilized and powerful. We kind of saw this with David Livingstone, in fact. And Sun Yat-sen was also convinced that democracy was important, that democracy would make you powerful, as we've seen so far in this class that it typically did. He will establish a political party called the Nationalist Party. He was a nationalist with a little n, but he will actually establish a formal political party, big N, right, capitalized, it's a proper name, called the Nationalist Party. And this party is governed by what he called the Three People's Principles. The first of these was nationalism. China should be ruled by Chinese people, not by foreigners, not by the Manchu. China should be a democracy. And finally, what's interesting is what he called people's livelihood. He didn't want to just bring pure capitalism to China because he thought that that would just impoverish Chinese people and lead to greater destitution for many people. And remember, many Chinese were poor and becoming poorer during this time period. So he wanted to have a kind of socialism to help make sure that Chinese people could just have basically a decent life at least. So he's willing to selectively adopt from the West. He's all for nationalism, all for democracy, not so sure about capitalism, right? He's willing to accept some capitalism, but he also wants some socialism. Many students really like this guy. They're attracted to his ideas. They want to study the new knowledge because it promises to make China powerful. They don't want to study Confucius anymore. And what's important is a lot of these students will later become soldiers, and he will have a lot of influence over the soldiers serving in the Qing army. And this guy's like constantly trying to overthrow the Qing dynasty. I think he tries and fails like 11 times. But he is a survivor, so no matter how many times he tries to overthrow the dynasty and fails, they're never able to get him, right? They're never actually able to get this guy. And this transformation, these kind of radical ideas are also reaching Chinese women, right? Remember, we had this basic question we keep asking, if all men are equal and democracy and nationalism emphasize equality, what about women, right? What about women? And Qiu Jin was someone who was saying, yeah, what about women? So Qiu Jin was a Chinese woman who was also an anti-Manchu nationalist like Sun Yat-sen. She wanted to have a revolution that would overthrow the Manchu and would then seize power for the Chinese people and establish a republic governed by the Chinese. And you can see her on the left, and I think that's a very interesting image of her. She has a traditional style clothing and hair, but you'll know she's also holding a knife, right? So that's kind of an interesting pose for a woman in this time period, but shows how women are changing, right? She's becoming a political actor on her own right, not because of who her husband is or because of her father is, but because of who she is. And it's also striking, it's important to stress that if you're a woman nationalist, there's a good chance you're also going to be a feminist, right? Because of these ideas of equality that go with nationalism and democracy, there's this idea that women should have these rights too, that women should have the opportunities that are available to men. And in a sense, she practiced this and tried to express it basically by cross-dressing. She would dress as a man, and I think the point of that was to say, look, whether you dress like a man or a woman doesn't matter. All of us have the same capabilities. We all have the same capacities, and we women can do the things that men do. And she would. She actually helped take part in an assassination attempt. She was basically part of a group of plotters who were going to assassinate a Manchu governor in order to launch a rebellion. This ultimately failed. Their kind of plot was discovered, and she was executed. Right, so she will actually be killed for her political ideas, not so much for her feminism, but because she takes part in an anti-Manchu nationalist uprising. Now, the way that the Qing Empire actually ends, the way that it actually falls apart and China has a successful revolution is, I think, very interesting. Basically, first of all, what is called the Wuchang Revolution, and this is the revolution that will overthrow the Qing dynasty, begins in 1911. It will end in 1912. And it's a curious thing because it wasn't really supposed to happen in 1911. This is what happened. In the city of Wuchang, there was a group of student revolutionaries, people who wanted to overthrow the Qing. And, if you want to overthrow a government, one thing you need are bombs. You need to make bombs so you can throw at government officials and blow up stuff as part of your efforts to overthrow the government. So these Chinese students, nationalist, anti-Manchu students, had a bomb-making party. they got together in one of their apartments, apartment units, and were in the kitchen making bombs. Now, here's rule number 1. If you're going to have a bomb-making party, no smoking. Smoking is hazardous to your health. It can cause a lot of diseases. It can also cause bombs to blow up. And what happened was one of the people making bombs was careless, was smoking while making a bomb, and some of the ashes from their cigarette fell into the bomb, making that bomb explode, which also made other bombs explode, which blew up the kitchen and killed a number of revolutionaries. The other people who lived in the apartment naturally were concerned about the explosion and called the authorities, and police and firemen showed up, and they realized that something had been going on here, and they discovered a list in the apartment of all the members of this secret revolutionary group dedicated to overthrowing the government. So rule number 2, if you are a member of a revolutionary group that's secret, that is dedicated to overthrowing the government, and which is a capital crime which can lead to you being executed, do not leave a list of all your members. That's a bad idea. So the police said, well, great, we got this list. Let's go arrest people. And the police start arresting people. And the students realize, oh, geez, we're all going to get thrown in jail. We just need to launch the rebellion now. And they do. And what's really important is many members of the local army were supportive of the revolutionaries. Many soldiers had become nationalists and supported the revolution. Remember how I said Sun Yat-sen had a lot of influence on students. He had all these student followers, some of whom joined the army or became people who would try and influence the army. So many soldiers, rather than trying to put down the rebellion, helped the rebellion. And so this will be a fairly quick rising. It will be over by 1912. It will overthrow the Qing Empire, destroys the old Confucian orthodoxy, and establishes the Republic of China. And Sun Yat-sen is elected the first president. What's really interesting is that he was actually in Colorado, I believe, when he was elected president. And he found out he was president of China because he read the newspaper and it said Sun Yat-sen is elected president of China. So kind of interesting way to find out that you're president. So there's a lot of hope. Initially, it's great. You know, China, after a fairly quick revolution, is able to destroy its or overthrow this old government, establish a new government. Now there's an opportunity for China to really reform and to become a strong country that's going to take care of its people. But unfortunately, the democracy will quickly become a dictatorship. Sun Yat-sen will be pushed from power by a general who has a big army, basically. Will use his army to push Sun from power. That guy will become a dictator and then just die. Like, it's really crazy. He becomes I'll give you his name just so you know it's not going to be on the exam. But this guy, Yuan Shikai, he has an army. He supports overthrowing the Qing Empire. And he uses that army to push Sun aside. So Sun is forced to resign his being president of China. And Yuan Shikai will become president of China. Then he becomes a dictator. Then he tries to become an emperor. Everyone laughs at him for becoming an emperor. And then he gets sad and he dies. And so China will fall apart. Right? This democracy quickly becomes a dictatorship and then falls apart. And China will fall apart into a civil war. And it's not clear to Chinese people what China should be. They know that it can't continue being what it is, but they need a new orthodoxy. They've gotten rid of Confucianism. That was their old orthodoxy, but they can't agree on a new one. And they need a new one in order to bring their country back together again, in order to reunite it.